National Ministries, who has a great love for this congregation. In fact, last week she said, "Say hello." So hello from Glynis. And also my husband Nick was also along on the trip. But it also included a group from Sherry Inksetter's church in St. Catharines, Ontario. So two of her congregation members, Joan and Joyce, came along, as well as another lay member from a church in Toronto. And we'll do the next one. Their primary reason for going was to visit a ministry called Samuel House in Romania. So it's a social ministry in one of the small villages in Romania that provides food and care and homework help and a home for poor children during the week. And when they come from the various villages where they live, they come into Samuel House during the week, they go to school, and they stay in the home from Monday to Friday, and then they return home to their parents on the weekend. Now, I must say, when we experienced Samuel House, we were blessed to meet the children and meet the very dedicated staff and all that kind of thing. But if you've been in Canada for a while, and if you've been part of the PCC and thinking about our confession of 25 years ago and are continuing living into that confession, we went with some questions. Because we were going to a residential setting for children from small towns, small villages, coming into this setting where they were receiving some religious education in their own faith, in the Reformed tradition, in their own language. They were Hungarian-speaking families. But we also had this sort of tension of not knowing, was this the right thing? What were they doing here? It's not the same. It's definitely not the same as Indian residential schools. So many of our discomforts were alleviated. Many of the families live in very poor circumstances, and many of them actually have the parents traveling to Western Europe for much of the week, going to work and send money home because of the really, really poor economic situation in Romania, where there's very little work, and the work that there is very, very poorly paid. And so there's a situation in Romania where there are many they call them orphans to migrant workers. So they get left, sometimes with grandparents, sometimes with one parent, but very often just with grandparents while their parents go off to work. And Samuel House really feels a need of providing that support for families so that their children can get a good education, but it also supports them to go back home, and it supports the parents as the parents. So we were encouraged by that. Now, I've got a whole bunch of slides, I think, coming up of various things at Samuel House. So this is outside Samuel House and in the dining room, and then the next one. That's one of the classrooms that they have right in the house, and Chila Bertalan is the director and sort of the house mother at Samuel House. She's got a whole pile of stuff in that picture of things that were brought from Canada, mostly from St. Giles Presbyterian Church in St. Catharines, Ontario. The next one, we spent a day out in the fields with the children. The itinerary said we were going to walk in the fields with the children, and we had no idea what we were going to do. But we went to a big park in the middle of the village, and they prepared traditional Hungarian food, and so we had a great, well, it was more than a picnic, it was quite a feast in the field, and we got to play. And of course the children spoke Hungarian as their first language. They have to learn Romanian as well because of where they live. It's a little bit like Anglophones in Quebec definitely needing to learn French. So it's that sort of dynamic around the language issues. We got to play with them and we didn't understand each other at all, but we could teach each other little words, and we could play frisbee, and we could do bead necklaces and all those things, because kids are kids everywhere, and it was a great experience of sharing with them. That's some of the kids. This is an image of one of the villages that we got to visit. In fact, before we went to Samuel House the first day, we went to one of the villages from which the kids come. And one of the grandmothers welcomed us into her home, where they go on the weekends. Very poor circumstances. And the next slide, this is actually in another type of village, in a Roma village. I don't know if anyone's familiar with the Roma people. Used to be, and actually in Romania, everybody called them gypsies. and we would probably be familiar with gypsies. Throughout Romania, there are millions of Roma people, and many of them, some of them live in the cities, some of them live in extremely poor villages with very little service. This village we went into had no running water, no proper bathroom facilities, really, really tough circumstances. And the Reformed churches in Romania struggle to respond in the small ways that they can. They cannot do anything about the big issues, but one of the things that they do is they run after-school programs for the kids. Their goal is to try to keep the kids in school as long as possible, and their goal is grade 4, and that's saying a lot. It's hard to get the kids to stay that long. But they provide after-school programs in some of the villages, and then they provide transportation to get the kids to them from various areas. And they feed them, and they provide homework help, and they let them play, and then they feed them again, and then they go home for the night. They live in little tiny one-room things. This family invited us into their home, which was 1 room, 5 children, I think 3 adults with a grandparent, and like 1 place for them to lie down in the little 1 room. Really difficult. The next slide, that one is, that was one of the after-school programs we visited, and the woman in the green is Judith. She's a Reformed pastor that we visited her church a little later on as well, and the woman in the middle, she's a diaconal worker, and she coordinates the after-school programs in all the Roma villages. Let's do the next one. In the city, in Aradia, which is where we were based, they also have after-school programs, and this is what, if you click it one more time, you'll see the video. You won't hear the singing too much, but that's okay. They're singing a song that sounds just like something our Sunday school kids or our kids at camp would be singing, and they were singing for us in Romania, and I think it was a song about God being like a pilot for our lives. They were flying and stuff like that. We can probably go on, because I realized I didn't set up for sound. So, this is another of the ministries of the Reformed Church in Romania called the Diaconia Christian Foundation, and it was a program for adults with developmental disabilities in which they learned sewing and crafting skills and produced various items for sale. So that's one of the places we visited. And this is the Laurent Fee Susanna Reformed High School, also in Aradia, in Romania. And we've had a connection with this school for a number of years through international ministries. And if any of you were paying attention to Gifts of Change, sort of, I think it must have been around 2005 to 2007, maybe somewhere in there. But this project showed up in our Gifts of Change catalog, and Canadian Presbyterians responded to it. The situation was similar to a lot of situations in Romania where during the communist era, a lot of church buildings and properties were seized. That happened to churches, to congregations, but also to many of the schools that were run by the churches. So this was a Reformed high school. They call it a high school. It actually goes from kindergarten all the way up through what we would consider high school. They had lost their building and lost their school, and after the communist era came to an end, after quite a while after it ended, they got the building back. They were given it back, but they told the church that they had to get it fixed up and running again within a time frame. I think they had something like 3 or 4 years. And once that time frame was done, if it wasn't in good shape again, the government was going to take it back again. So they had a deadline, and they didn't know how they were going to make it. So Canadian Presbyterians gave generously to help them fix up their building and get their Reformed school up and running again. For them, it's a place where all children are welcome. They don't have to be Reformed Christians to attend, but the school provides religious education, and it also provides cultural education in terms of Hungarian culture and in terms of Hungarian language, which isn't provided in other schools in the community. If you go back one more time, that last one, The students on the left were high school students getting ready for an assembly, and they were learning Hungarian dances. So they shared some of the dances with us that they were learning. All right, go to the next one. This is the church we visited on Sunday and worshipped in. It doesn't look like a church, does it? It's another example of a congregation where they lost their building. It was seized. Later, when they were ready to have the opportunity to build again, to find a space, they couldn't get their old building back, so they started again, and they bought a house, and they turned it into a church. So that's the outside, and the next slide is the inside. Inside, it looks like a church, and a very beautiful church. And they have two ministers there, Judith and Zoltan, who are husband and wife, two pastors serving that congregation. Early in the visit that we had in Hungary and Romania, people were referring to what we were doing there as a mission trip. And I found myself feeling a little bit uncomfortable with the language. Yes, our denomination and Sherry's congregation support Samuel House with financial gifts, and they brought along a suitcase full of school supplies and toys and candies to give to the ministry as well. But it wasn't so much about us going to do something for the Reformed Church in Romania. I wanted to call it a partner visit, not a mission trip. Or I might say that if it was a mission trip, that our mission was to build relationships and grow in unity. We went to meet with Christian friends in Hungary and Romania. We got to know them. We learned about their history and their context. We heard about their ministries. We experienced the pain of their struggles and challenges, rejoiced with them in their successes, reflected on what we shared in common, what we could relate to, and what we were learning from them. And we began to love our new Christian friends. If you read the December issue of the Presbyterian Connection newspaper, I wrote about several of the women in ministry that we met and how I loved those women. And I'm so excited because several of those women are going to be coming to Canada in May to attend our Presbyterian Women's Gathering in Richmond Hill. I don't know if anyone from here is planning to go to that, but it's a wonderful opportunity to connect with women from across our country, but also from Hungary and Romania this year. And during that time, I think that our communion grew stronger, our unity in Christ. Not that we were in agreement about everything. There were certainly some theological differences, different polities and priorities, and significant cultural differences as well. And yet there was unity in Christ and in the sharing of mutual love, support, and hospitality. Now I've got some slides and we'll run through these ones pretty quickly, but we have, so we're in, the last one was one of the bishops that we met with. The fellow in the white shirt just to my right, I guess, as you look at it, is Bishop Currie in Oradea. And then next slide. This is back in Budapest, and this is in Calvin Square. Their Reformed history is very strong there. And then the next one is another bishop. This is the bishop in Budapest. And then some of the staff from the mission department and from the National Roma Ministry and the youth ministry coordinators in that picture. Basically, this was kind of like going to 50 Winford Drive, but for Hungary. So we also visited the Scottish Mission, which is an English-speaking congregation in Budapest. So that was a neat experience as well. And this one is the bottom picture. We met one of a Korean Presbyterian or Korean Reformed pastor who has a congregation in Budapest. The Koreans are all over, so it was interesting. He wanted to meet us because he knew there were Koreans in Canada as well. And the one at the top is a mission that we went to in the city in Budapest. And it's a Roma ministry that started as an after-school program for kids and then sort of developed and changed into kind of a worshiping community, a very informal worshiping community where the parents of those kids started to engage and that sort of thing. And this pastor was talking about doing missional theology and his missional way of working. And I thought it's just like the kinds of things that we are stretching ourselves into in Canada, thinking about different ways to do ministry that don't necessarily look like a traditional congregation all the time. But they have gatherings that were centered around meals and sharing and delving into the scriptures, but not formal worship services, sitting like we do in church. And let's do the next one. Right at the beginning of our trip, actually, we visited the Kulumba Refugee Integration Program in Budapest. This is a ministry in Budapest for refugees who are coming into Hungary and going to settle in various places. It was very familiar to those of us from Canada because we've all been, lots of Canadian Presbyterians have been involved in refugee settlement programs, and we've sponsored families from different parts of the world. It's a different story in Hungary, partly because since 2015 they were so close to all that migration that was happening, and also because the climate with their government and generally in their society was so extremely anti-refugee. So this refugee ministry functions because of the church's support in an extremely negative environment. If we thought we have some challenges in Canada in terms of welcoming refugees, it's night and day compared to what the staff here are doing. Our church has had connections with this ministry over a number of years. We've sent interns there who've worked with them for sometimes young adult interns, and Stephanie Chunu was their most recent intern. She was actually just finishing up her time there during the time we visited. And since then, the Reverend Jeannie Lee has gone over to spend a 3-year mission appointment through International Ministries with this ministry in Budapest. We also had a day trip to Debrecen, which was described as the reformed Rome of Hungary. We've met some of the leadership there and visited with the equivalent of their presbytery office. And we also visited the Great Church, an absolutely massive congregation with 4 clergy, and the building was probably 12 times the size of this building we're standing in right now. It was huge. And the last slide is just us enjoying the sights in Budapest with our group. Everywhere that I have been traveling this year, I have encountered people living together in Christian communities and congregations with beautiful diversity and difference being expressed and often celebrated. The congregations have included diversity of theological perspectives, of obviously gender, of sexual orientation, of race and culture, and all kinds of things. And so it's a little sampling of the places I've been. This is St. Andrews in Dartmouth, Nova Scotia, and King's in New Minas, Nova Scotia, St. George's in River John, Nova Scotia. I dropped in on, they were doing a VBS program. And this is Knox Presbyterian Church in Oakville, Ontario. I went home, sort of, to Saskatoon. And Richmond Presbyterian Church in BC. This is a congregation that has grown massively in their ethnic diversity. They are beginning to more closely reflect the neighborhood in which they are located, which is wonderful to see. And while I was out in BC, I had a chance to connect with the Indonesian community. This was kind of a throw-in. The 2 folks on the left with me are 2 students at Vancouver School of Theology, Presbyterian students, and they're both Indonesian in background. And so I was invited to join them for a house church meeting, worship and dinner, with other Indonesians, not all Presbyterians. There were a whole mix of different Protestant and even a few Catholics among them, for a wonderful experience of worship and sharing. This is in Winnipeg at St. John's Presbyterian Church, where I got to visit with the presbytery and also to experience one of their newer projects, which is a music program for children that they're using as an outreach to the community, inviting people with young preschool-age children to come in and learn music. And I was at Camp Getty, that was mentioned. While I was in Nova Scotia, I dropped in at Camp Getty and had a tour, which was wonderful. And while I was in Vancouver, actually not quite in Vancouver, outside Vancouver, I got to go see Camp Douglas, which is in the Sunshine Coast. It has been a pleasure to meet and get to know some of these beautiful people that belong to our church. Finally, I want to mention my commitment to healing and reconciliation between the Presbyterian Church in Canada and Indigenous peoples. Most of you likely know that this year we are marking 25 years since our church first made its confession to Indigenous people for our participation in the Indian residential school system. There's a slide of, that is some of the National Indigenous Ministries Council present at the last General Assembly with us to witness our conversations. Some, of course, of those members were also commissioners to the Assembly, but those that weren't were there with us to witness and be part of the conversation. Although it may have been somewhat overshadowed at Assembly by the same-sex marriage debates and discussion, steps towards reconciliation were a very important part of what happened. We did make the decision to officially reject and repudiate the doctrine of discovery, the idea that nations had the right to claim territory that they found empty or not settled and farmed according to European standards. And we have some more work to do to figure out what that repudiation will mean for how we function as a church now and in the future. At this next General Assembly, there will be more recommendations coming back to us that are fleshing out what our next steps need to be in living into that repudiation of the doctrine of discovery and what it means for our church. Next slide. While the Assembly was meeting in June, the report on missing and murdered Indigenous women and girls was also released, with many, many calls for justice, including some directed at Canadians in general. The Assembly declared that we would read it, reflect on it, and consider how our church could or should respond to the calls for justice. Another priority for me this year, as moderator, has been to go and meet some of the Indigenous ministers and communities across our church. I was already connected to the ministries in Saskatchewan, the mission in Saskatoon, and the congregation at Mr. Wass's First Nation. But now I've also visited the Kenora Fellowship Centre in Northern Ontario, Winnipeg Inner City Missions, and Place of Hope Presbyterian Church in Manitoba. In January, I visited Hummingbird Ministries in the Vancouver area. So there are a few pictures. That's in Kenora. And this is at Place of Hope Presbyterian Church. Margaret Mullen is on the right. You just see the back of her head. But we are looking at a banner that they have up in their worship space. All of those handprints and the names that are on there represent people in the community that they have lost through death. They are a community that has experienced a huge amount of loss, a huge amount of grief, and they remember that and honor the people that have been part of their community. On the other side, that's Brian Harper. Those who were at Assembly will remember he was one of the members of the Indigenous Ministries Council who was a commissioner and spoke a number of times and brought great wisdom to our Assembly. This is also at Place of Hope. They are a people who pray. I was honored and deeply blessed by the ways that our Indigenous leadership prayed for me during the Assembly, and then here at Place of Hope, where they invited me to participate in smudging, and also prayed for me, gave me the honor of preaching, and then prayed for me, which was a blessing. There is so much that I could say about the hospitality and support that I have received from Indigenous ministers in our church. When I was with the people of Place of Hope Presbyterian Church, I shared about what our denomination is trying to do about reconciliation, the steps that we are taking, confessing the errors of the past, and taking small steps in new directions. And I invited them to teach us, to show us what is needed and what is best, and to share the truth and beauty of their Indigenous traditions with us. And this picture is some of the youth who were present at worship on the day I was there. During the worship, similar to many of our congregations, the younger children were present at the beginning, and then they went out for Sunday school classes. And before the end of the service, they came back in and they brought gifts for me. And they brought 2 big posters that they had made. And one was a representation of the fruit of the Spirit from Galatians 5:22. And the other was the 7 sacred teachings of Indigenous tradition: truth, love, respect, courage, honesty, humility, and wisdom. I thought it was a beautiful coming together of our Christian faith together with Indigenous teachings, and a good representation of how they beautifully go together. Just a note that these young people are the ones from Place of Hope who hope to attend Canada Youth 2020, and I know they can still use more support to help them get there. This is Mary Fontaine, and I visited her ministry at Hummingbird Ministries in and around Vancouver. The next one, this was at a sharing circle that we had in Surrey. Folks gathered together to pray and share and reflect on scripture and sing. And a big part of what Mary is doing in Hummingbird Ministries is helping to pass on Indigenous traditions and spirituality to the next generations. So teaching them songs, teaching them drumming, teaching them dancing. Next slide. We also had a benefit concert for Hummingbird while I was out there, and it included a jazz trio doing some wonderful music, and also, next slide, some wonderful dancing. So we got to have a little bit of a taste of the things that the children in the community are learning. And the next one. We also visited some other locations where Hummingbird Ministries takes place, at the Tuasin First Nation, and at Gibson's and the Seashelt First Nation. As moderator, I have a special opportunity to go and meet with Indigenous ministers and communities, but it's something that many more of us need to do, whether by attending a healing and reconciliation tour or building a partnership with one of the ministries. Going and meeting one another is the first step. Getting to know one another comes next. Growing in love comes swiftly and easily, though sometimes painfully too. As Indigenous people, both share their pain with us and invite us into new relationship. And then comes unity. Well, we're not quite there yet, but I believe that it is possible, that unity is God's will for us, and that God will do it. God will make us one across Christian traditions, across cultures, across geography and language, and across theological differences. In order to unite with one another, we must love one another. In order to love one another, we must know one another. In order to know one another, we must go and meet one another. It was a privilege, and go to the next one, to be invited into meetings with the executive of the National Indigenous Ministries Council as they were discussing the report on missing and murdered Indigenous women and girls. This picture is together with members of the executive, as well as Alison Carr, who works in Justice Ministries, and Jen DeCombe, who works in Canadian Ministries at our national office. Again, if anyone is a commissioner or paying attention to the next General Assembly, there will be recommendations coming from that report for the PCC's next steps in terms of our response. It's been a lot of visiting, but in between, I have been back home in my own congregation where I'm still the minister. So there's a few slides from there. Oh, this is not quite back home. This is in Saskatoon at the retirement party for the Reverend Stuart Folster from the Saskatoon Native Circle Ministry. And we'll go on to the next one. This is the Synod of Saskatchewan meeting back in October. This gives you a sense of the little tiny community of Presbyterians I come from. That's Synod. That's the VBS last summer at my church. And that's some of our youth from our congregation. That was a bowling day and a lunch after church that we had with our youth group. So there are things happening in my own church at home when I get there. Next one. And in January, my congregation got to celebrate our 95th anniversary, because we were one of those churches formed just after the United Church of Canada was formed. And we got to have the Reverend Dr. Jean Morris, also a former moderator, come back home to the church where she grew up in Regina and to be our anniversary preacher, and we had a good celebration. The last slide is a group picture of my congregation on our anniversary Sunday. Even when I'm home in Saskatchewan, I feel very connected to the church across the country. And almost every week I get this notification. If you can, you may not be able to read it from the back, that I'm a top fan of the Presbyterian Church in Canada. That's a Facebook notification for anyone who's not on Facebook. So that's the end of my quick tour through being moderator this year. I'm really thankful for the opportunity to be with you and to get a glimpse of your congregation, and those of you who came from other congregations in the area. Thanks for welcoming me, and I think we're going to move into Q&A if there are things you want to ask me about. Or comment about, you can also make comments too if it's not a question.
Jack McDonald is going to take that. And just put your hand up if you have questions. I warned you guys you were to have questions.
Well, arbitrarily give the microphone to people.
A lot of people asked me questions from the session who were here for dinner. I got really good questions at that point. So.
Silence means assent. We talked about that this morning.
Silence means assent. Yeah. There could be polity questions, there could be ecumenical questions, or whatever. Or just comments beyond. Yeah.
First of all, thank you very much for coming to visit us. It was quite impressive, your tour, and to see Canadians and spiritual colleagues across Canada. One of the things that's really interesting that you talked about was the coming together through diversity, like whether it's interfaith. And I was wondering if you could speak more to that, especially about some of the issues that can be polarizing and how you see that could bring us, how including different points of views can make us grow in some of those questions. For example, LGBTQ or same-sex marriage, those kinds of some still polarizing questions.
Yeah, it's interesting because, and I didn't get into the LGBTQ issue and the same